Hello everyone, and welcome to this short video where I want to offer some suggestions and notes on the Module 3 readings. First, I want to thank you for the feedback that you gave me through the survey. Both the quantitative and the qualitative feedback were really helpful in me understanding what aspects of the Modules 1 and 2 video summaries were helpful. So what I'm going to do moving forward is I think that the highlighted PDFs seem to be helpful in focusing your reading on certain parts and helping you avoid other aspects of the readings that you didn't need to spend a lot of time with. So moving forward, I'll be providing that folder each time and not worrying about the other folder that Moodle kind of produces, which links you to the articles. But what I'll do in these videos is I do want to offer slides and specific bullet points so that way you have an even more focused review of what some of the main points are that I want you to get from the readings, and it can again help you. You can kind of search for these bullet point ideas within the highlighted sections of each reading, because essentially what I did was I'm trying to highlight the aspects that I cover in these slides. So on the first reading that I'll go over, the Coombs article from 2007. So this is a really kind of foundational article. You'll see, of course, this author is cited a lot. This is one of the kind of foremost experts on crisis communication, and has developed a theory that is very widely used and cited. But you'll see some readings in this module that more recent ones that challenge some of the aspects of the theory. But what I want you to get from this reading is a general foundation or understanding of what the situational crisis communication theory is. I offer here a definition of crisis as this sudden unexpected event, and I'll note I am it's both good and bad. It's I don't want to have shade and fraud here, but there's some it's very, in a way, interesting that we are going through crisis communication at this moment. There's a lot of crises that brands and organizations are navigating for a variety of reasons. And so if we just were to focus on, let's say, the NRA and gun safety legislation, brands are finding there's no real middle ground on this topic. And so it's difficult to really stay neutral. And so it kind of forces a lot of brands to be in crisis communication mode, especially if they had any kind of relationship with the NRA. So there's that and many other brands and organizations that are facing crisis today make this a interesting time to see a lot of examples of crisis communication in the real world. So of course I direct you to understanding what the author means by reputation, what stakeholders refers to, which you should have a decent sense of, but it's always nice to see more examples there. I want you to consider how the harm that crises can have on you and me as stakeholders, and note in the readings how there's this physical, emotional, and financial harm that people can face, which makes responding to crisis really, really important for any organization. Of course, there's ethical responsibilities, and so I think Coombs does a good job of consistently through his writing pointing out that the first thing that an organization should do is protect stakeholders from harm. That should be the first focus as opposed to defending the reputation. And then at the bottom of this slide, you'll see I direct you to a few different parts from the reading. So there's some factors that Coombs argues shapes reputational threats, so I encourage you to check those out. There's supposedly 3 types of crises, and you'll note that there's some of the readings throughout the module kind of define these a little bit differently, but they're fairly consistent. But begin to get familiar with what different types of crises are. And then you'll note there's 3 different objectives to a response strategy. So again, review that on page 171 and be familiar with what Coombs argues there. The next reading, I'm going in order of the readings that I presented in the reading folder that was originally on Moodle, in part because I ordered them somewhat specifically for one to follow the other. So in this second reading from authors Chung and Lee, this one reviews the crisis communication strategy a little bit more in depth. And what I want you to focus on here is getting a sense of what is the difference between a crisis response strategy and a technical translation strategy. So if you can get through this reading and have a good sense of what those 2 concepts deal with, that's excellent, that's great. certainly be familiar with these three general areas or types of crisis communication strategies. And so these again come up over the readings, and so having things repeated is helpful. But be familiar with what instructing information refers to, adjusting information, and reputation repair. And again, the order of those is supposedly important from the perspective of Coombs, that you shouldn't start with reputation repair. We should start with instructing or adjusting information. So be familiar with what those terms mean. And then, looking at the actual results, if you go down to the discussion section, again, don't worry about the results section in a lot of these articles. The discussion section will give you the same information, but in a much more straightforward and shorter format. So what did the authors find more effective for foster farms? Because essentially they were testing, what if you take a more crisis response strategy, which maybe deals a bit more with reputation repair, versus a technical translation strategy, which, more appropriately considers how stakeholders are feeling, what they're fearful of, and what they're worried about. So what did the authors actually find? All right, in this next reading from Coombs and Halliday, which looked at how publics react to different crisis communication efforts. In this reading, I want you to focus on the importance of understanding what crisis publics are in spreading information. So I thought this was a really interesting concept that was introduced that I think is important for this module moving forward, to understand crisis communication as essentially managing how other people talk about your organization and managing how other people talk about the crisis and what happened. There's also these ideas of rhetorical arena, and then in this reading they study what they call sub-arenas of the rhetorical arena. So be familiar with what they mean there, right? They're generally referring to this idea of a place and a kind of not real place, but a place online where people are able to congregate and talk about a crisis or an organization. And so what specifically do they mean there, and why is that important to this reading? And then be familiar with these two key roles of crisis communication publics or receivers that are highlighted in this reading. They note that these different groups of stakeholders can either indicate acceptance of a crisis response, so they can be valuable to an organization for that reason, and also the other role they play for an organization is they help shape and share that organization's reputation. So if the organization has a good reputation, they can share that. If not, they'll share that. So it's important to understand how these publics and receivers of information, how are they understanding a crisis. And then again, considering the discussion section, what does the discussion section highlight in terms of differences in the stakeholder response from the two sub-arenas they studied, one of which was a blog specific to the organization, and then one was a more public, news site or news blog. So consider what is the difference in how stakeholders responded to this crisis on those different rhetorical spaces. So in this reading, which is a chapter from Sandra Duhay's book, this reading again now shifts our attention to a different kind of model or approach to understanding crisis communication. So this reading and others that follow it introduce us to the social mediated crisis communication model. So some main points I want you to focus on here are what new opportunities does social media offer in a crisis? And this again can seem straightforward or obvious, but I just want you to reflect on them in terms of the idea that we have this sense of immediacy, that an organization doesn't have to wait to release a press release or to put something in a newspaper or go through television channels. Organizations now can immediately address a crisis. Of course, the problem then is other stakeholders can respond to that crisis in bad ways, or now we expect organizations to respond right away. So they can't say, well, sorry, it's Friday night, 10 o'clock, we all left the office, we'll respond to the crisis on Monday. That's not really an option. So now organizations have to constantly monitor their presence and what's happening. So in this reading, also focus on the importance of social media in crisis communication practice. So how is it that organizations are using social media? And in that sense, consider the three publics that the SMCC focuses on, how the publics that they argue should be considered by any organization or anyone that is in crisis are these three groups: the influential creators, social media followers, and social media inactives. All right, so be familiar with what those three groups are. And then what are the 5 factors that affect how organizations engage with each group? Yeah, obviously I don't need you to memorize these verbatim, but I want you to be familiar with the idea of differences in how you would engage with a group of followers or invested stakeholders based on kind of who they are. And then I note that this reading again refers to, and kind of the model borrows a bit from the theory from Coombs. So note that the SCCT focuses on telling us the first thing we should do in a crisis is focus on instructing information and adjusting information, both of which consider how stakeholders are feeling and what they're worried about. So understand that's always the first priority, not managing your brand's reputation. And then finally, what are the effects of crisis information, sources of information, and crisis origin? What role do they play in this reading on how organizations should speak to consumers? Okay, this next reading from Jin et al., meaning and others, which examines social media and effective crisis management. I want you to be familiar with what this reading highlights as the purpose or goals of the SMCC. So what is the general purpose of that model? Like, who is it helpful for? Why is it they develop it? And then I point you here to Figure 1 on page 78. I want you to just at least have a general understanding of the relationship between kind of two groups of three. In my mind, grouping these terms, concepts, or groups into these bunches of three is helpful. So understand the concepts of the social media creators versus social media followers and social media inactives. So just have a general sense of what they mean by those three groups and maybe how they kind of relate to each other or they don't. And then just generally understand the idea of this host organization where a crisis might come up for, and then the idea of how they relate, how are they connected to social media, traditional media. And then of course once you have those two sets of three, the model tries to explain how they're all related, but I just want you to have a general sense of what those parts of the model are. So then also down lower in the article, I want you to, toward the discussion section, I want you to focus on what the effects are of the internal crisis origin and whether the crisis came kind of from the organization and whether it was something that was their fault. How does that affect how people respond? How does that affect how the messaging should be formatted? And within that section of this article, they also discuss the impact of message source, so where that crisis communication is coming from, meaning the organization itself or maybe a third party, somebody else. And then there's another section that I think that I want you to focus on, which addresses the impact of an external crisis origin. So what happens if a crisis is going on, but it's not really a particular organization or individual's fault? What does that mean for how people respond to the crisis and respond to their messaging? And how does that, again, messaging maybe change between the organization itself and a third party? So in this next reading from Key and Brown, where they look at the effective crisis response strategies on consumer relationships, I want you to focus on a few things. First is what are these three components of a crisis response strategy? So again, these are things that are being highlighted from before. So again, we see the SCCT come up again. So I just want you to again be familiar with that and really have a good sense of what instructing information is, adjusting information, and reputation management. This reading again covers attribution theory, which has come up before in descriptions of the situational crisis communication theory. But just be generally familiar with what that attribution theory is, why is that folded into crisis communication theory. And then what are the 3 factors of reputational threat according to Coombs? So be familiar with what Coombs means by initial crisis responsibility. Be familiar with what Coombs means by crisis history, and be familiar with prior relational reputation. So those are three pretty big factors that any one crisis doesn't exist in isolation. If it's the 10th time an organization has gotten into the same crisis, that kind of matters. It matters a lot more than another organization where it's their first time in a particular crisis. We're going to respond differently there. So the final thing too, because there's a lot of content in this reading that I don't need you to focus on, but I did actually feel as though the appendix where they describe some of their manipulations, I thought that's actually really interesting and instructive. So I encourage you to check out the appendix because it gives you a sense of how they manipulated their message, what they call frames. And I think in reading through some of those examples, you can get a sense of what different approaches to crisis communication might look like. And finally, I don't have a lot here for this last reading, the Coombs reading from 2015, where he summarizes kind of current knowledge or best practices in crisis communication. Really, I included that article just because I thought it's kind of a nice overall summary after going through all the other readings. It's a nice way to kind of review a lot of these main concepts and main terms and theories that keep coming up. And so I just felt I don't need you to really read through it in detail. It's kind of short anyway, but just focusing on the different section headings would be, I think, a great way to refamiliarize yourself with a lot of the terms and concepts that come up in this module. So that's it. So you'll notice I don't really review the case studies from each module. Those are ones that I include because I think they're generally interesting. They provide some kind of a example of a real-world example of what we're covering that module. So I encourage you to go through the case study kind of at your leisure just to get a nice sense of seeing some of these discussions in action and to also get some nice just general examples of how scholars can kind of document the success or failures of different social media efforts and what are ways you can come up with figures or tables or symbol screenshots to kind of defend a case that you're making. So that's it. Thanks for watching. And of course, reach out to me with any questions you might have about the crisis communication.